Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Object Talk. My name is Emma and I am the Engagement Officer at the Jewish Museum London. And I'm really pleased to introduce our wonderful volunteer Isabelle, who will be leading this week's talk. Isabelle has been volunteering with our museum for just over 2.5 years, and in that time she's welcomed many visitors to our museum. This month, across the museum, we are celebrating Women's History Month, and Isabelle has chosen an object that fits into this theme perfectly, a wedding dress currently on display in our history gallery. So Isabelle, I will now hand over to you to share with us your object.
Thank you, Emma. This is the wedding dress of Milly Witkop, who married Charles Briggenstone, a taxi driver, at Bond's Hotel in Aldgate, London in 1925. Milly was a shorthand typist, and she earned enough to have the dress made to measure by a dressmaker in Hampshire. It's a lovely dress, a very fashionable flapper style with gorgeous beading work. However, there's only so much that can be said about one dress, beautiful as it is. So this talk is going to use the dress as a springboard to look at the Jewish East End and some inspiring women in its history. But first, let me tell you a bit about Bond's Hotel. Bond's Hotel was founded by Joseph Bond, a pastry cook from the Netherlands. He established the first kosher catering firm in Britain back in 1860 in Prescott Street, then called Great Prescott Street. And the company operated a purpose-built bakery in Whitechapel. By 1910, it had merged with another catering company started by Lloyd Rakusen and was known as Bond, Rakusen & Co. The company still exists today and is now simply called Rakusen's. Bond's Hotel was only one of hundreds of businesses in the East End that catered to a majority Jewish clientele. There were bakers and butchers. In 1901, there were 15 kosher butchers in Wentworth Street alone. There were bookshops selling books in Yiddish. There were fabric stores, one of which, Aprah Fabrics on Brick Lane, is still trading today. There were movie houses, there were theaters putting on plays in Yiddish, there were Sunday street markets, coffee houses, confectioners, and on and on. Not to mention Jewish schools and, of course, synagogues. During the 20s and 30s, there were over 65 synagogues in the area. The East End at that time was the center of Jewish life in Britain. Let's backtrack a bit to explain how that came to be. It started in the late 19th century. From the 1880s onward, the area around Whitechapel, Spitalfields and Shoreditch saw a huge influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. Estimates range from about 140,000 to about 200,000. They were fleeing the pogroms and persecution that were happening in Russia, Poland and Ukraine. Some of them traveled entirely on foot to Hamburg or Rotterdam, where they would board the boat to England and travel in appalling conditions. Many of them were probably hoping to travel further to America, and many of them did, but a lot of them were desperately poor and could not afford it, so they stayed. And some of them stayed because they were following a relative where they migrated earlier. In fact, the number of immigrants was so great that in 1905, Parliament passed the Aliens Act, which introduced immigration controls and registration for the first time. This was followed by the Aliens Restriction Act in 1914, which attempted to restrict immigration even further. The act was eventually repealed in 1919. In London, The immigrants would arrive in the Isles of Dogs to the east, where the docks were, and they would tend to settle in the vicinity for a number of reasons. There was already a Jewish community there, as well as Jewish charitable organizations that could help them settle in. But also, at that time, it was an undesirable part of London, so the cost of rent was cheaper and all they could afford. By 1914, 90% of all Jews in England would live around Whitechapel and Spitalfields, sometimes making up to 95% of the population in those areas. And so the East End became a thriving Jewish neighborhood, even electing the first female Jewish mayor in the country in 1932, Miriam Moses in Stepney. She was born in Princely Street in 1886, and a blue plaque there commemorates her achievements. At the turn of the century, the newly arrived immigrants would find employment in low-wage, labor-intensive trades, the clothing trades, for example, and also furniture making, boots and shoe making, and the tobacco industry. The work would often be done from home or from workshops, sweatshops really by today's standards. And the work would often be done in crowded and unsanitary conditions. They had no employment rights and they had no employment protection. We do not know much about Lily Arbisman, but one thing we do know about her is that she belonged to the Communist Party. This was not unusual. Jews in the East End were active in the Communist Party in a higher proportion than British citizens, and this was true for both men and women. This was fueled by two driving forces. One I have already mentioned, the unsanitary, overcrowded working and living conditions and the lack of employment rights. The other driving force was probably the new political ideas in the form of socialism and trade unionism brought by the new immigrants. One remarkable woman was active in the trade unions movement at the time Lily Arbisman got married was Sarah Wesker. Sarah Wesker was a trousers machinist at Goodman's factory, a clothing manufacturer. In 1926, she led a strike amongst the all-female workforce to campaign for better pay and better working conditions. She was only 25 years old, and some of the women workers were only 16 or 17 years old. Sarah Wesker went on to organize women and lead strikes about working conditions and pay in several garment factories in the East End between 1926 and 1930. In 1929, she was one of the founding members of a new union, the United Clothing Workers Union, and she was also the only woman on its committee. By 1933, she was a full-time women's organizer, first for the United Clothing Workers Union, and then, a few years later, for another larger trade union, the National Union of Tailors and Garment Workers. She was the first woman to be elected to the British Communist Party Central Committee in 1932, and she remained active in the trade union movement and Communist Party her whole life until she died of a stroke in 1971. We can only speculate about this, but Sarah Wesker may well have been influenced by the activism of Milly Witkop, a political activist who was a formative figure in both the anarcho-syndicalist movement and the feminist movement before and after the First World War, first in the UK, then in Berlin, and finally in the United States. She emigrated from Ukraine into the UK when she was 17, and she worked in a tailoring workshop where she earned enough to send for the rest of her family. She became part of a group of Jewish anarchists and helped edit their newspaper called Arbeiterfriend, Workers' Friend, that had been founded at the turn of the century. Milly Witkop and her husband also ran a soup kitchen before the First World War. She also took part in protests against the war, and for this she was arrested in 1916 and spent 2 years in prison. After that, she and her husband moved first to Berlin in 1918 and then to the United States, all the while continuing their political work. Milly Witkop had strong views about the position of women in society, arguing that working class women were exploited on two fronts, by capitalism, like their fellow male workers, but also by the men themselves. She advocated for domestic work to be seen as equally valuable to wage labor, and she called for access to birth control and a childbearing strike. Those were pretty revolutionary ideas in the period between the wars. To put things in some context, in this country, women only gained the right to vote at the same age as men in 1928. I want to end this talk with one last great woman of the interwar period and beyond, Hannah Billig, who was informally known as the Angel of Cable Street. Hannah Billig was born in 1901 in Spitalfields. Her parents were Russian Jewish immigrants and she grew up around Brick Lane. She qualified as a doctor in 1925 at a time where there were not many women doctors or schools to train them. Until 1927, she worked in the Jewish maternity hospital in Whitechapel. In 1927, she set up a small clinic at Watney Street in Shadwell, which was at that time one of the most deprived districts in the East End. In her practice, she treated patients whether they could afford to pay her or not. This was before the NHS, when many people could not afford a doctor. In 1935, she moved her practice to number 198 Cable Street, where a blue plaque commemorates her achievements. There's an anecdote from World War II that well illustrates how dedicated she was to helping people. In 1941, she was injured in a bomb blast while she was treating people injured in an air raid. And despite her injury, she continued to care for the wounded that night. She was awarded the George Medal for her bravery. She spent the rest of the war tending to wounded soldiers in India, and she was made an MBE in 1945. After the war, she came back to the UK to resume her practice, and she worked as a GP within the NHS. She retired in 1964, but she did not stop her work. She retired to the coast of Israel, where she continued to provide healthcare in both Arab and Jewish settlements until her death in 1987. So as I said at the beginning, this talk ended up not really being about a wedding dress at all, but I hope it was enjoyable nonetheless. And it's a lovely, lovely wedding dress, and if you haven't seen it already, I would absolutely recommend seeing it in the museum when it opens. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle, so much for such a fascinating object talk. It was really interesting to explore all those different pioneering women from the East End of London. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today and marking Women's History Month with us. Do join us again next week, where to celebrate the festival of Passover, we will have a special series of object talks, joining with different museums across the country to reflect on the different themes of the festival. We will see you there.